Have a quick talk on the fragile alliance between esports journalism and esports, and esports business. Richard's going to talk for a little bit, then we're going to take our break and have lunch. So hopefully that fits for everybody else. Richard,
yeah,
you
awesome.
would? Good.
Can everyone hear me okay? Is that good? They just mic me up. So yeah, as my colleague there has introduced, this is called Fragile Alliance when esports business meets esports journalism. So first I want to just say how great it is to be the only journalist in esports that's speaking today. It taps greatly into my sense of narcissism, and of course nobody can correct me whatsoever. No one has that authority. I've been writing about esports for approximately, I would say, 10, 11 years. I kind of fell into it by accident. I was writing an assignment for a mainstream gaming publication about esports, which they didn't use and frankly didn't pay me for. It was an absolute disaster. But I met a bunch of people that I realized needed to have sort of that voice. There was nobody that was actually talking in a truthful manner about the things that were happening in this new emerging industry. So I've held a job as an editor, which, by the way, if there are any editors in the room, that's the worst job in the world. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. I've been an investigative reporter. I've been an interviewer. I've been a commentator on games. I've been a Twitch broadcaster. I'm indeed currently a Twitch partner, not one of the paid ones, just one of the lowly peons. And I've been responsible for giving many breaks to and training many of the young journalists that are working in our industry today. Now, as I said, the reason I decided that I wanted to stay in this business and sort of couldn't get out was because I saw that there was a very young group of people that had no life experience in a way because of the necessary commitments to any sport, to esports, the amount of time you have to put in, and of course the core demographic is young people. But equally as well, people that were sort of being exploited. They were being taken advantage of by people that did have that experience. Some people call it advocacy journalism. I think that's kind of a dismissive term, but it's one that I'm happy to sort of have thrown at me when people are being derogatory because, you know, if I don't do it, who else is going to? So the subject of journalism, and specifically how it's received by a lot of the guys out here in the audience, fascinates me. Really does. And if it doesn't fascinate you, don't worry. It's only going to be 15 minutes. It won't be any more awkward than a lot of the conversations you're going to have over this weekend as you're exchanging business cards. But it fascinates me because it seems that the simple act of undertaking journalism is deemed to be an act of aggression. It pits me, the journalist, against you, whoever you may be, in the esports business. So why is this? So the quick answer to this is due to outmoded revenue streams. Organizations primarily rely on converting popularity into money. That's a very simple summary of how our business works. And this can be done by click-through advertising, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. This can be done through sign-ups using referral codes. I mean, when people come to conferences like this or they go and negotiate sponsors, they don't necessarily come with anecdotal evidence. They come with the Google Analytics all printed out, look at our metrics. So it's all about reach. It's all about engagement. All those other buzzwords. Everyone who runs a website has a database of users that are all potential consumers if you're subject to the right marketing campaigns. And crucially, the way our industry differs from almost anything else is that we rely on sponsorship money, or as I like to call it, the gimmies. We like to just go with our cap in hand and we like to say, give me some money and you know, I can put you in touch with all these awesome people out here. So, because of this reliance on popularity, this means that you have to have this incredibly squeaky clean public persona. So now, we also have to accept that the internet generation is very different to my generation, different to a lot of the older chaps in the audience, and that is that it believes in civilian justice. Now, I recommend that any of you go home and you buy a copy of a book by John Ronson, an excellent journalist. He's recently published a book called You Have Been Publicly Shamed. It's a great title. And what it talks about is how our internet generation will actually try and right wrongs themselves. They'll be activists in their own way, which means they'll happily write emails, they'll tweet out or even propose boycotts to corporate sponsors of these said organizations. They'll demand tangible resolutions before the campaign stops. And no one feels bad about doing this, as Ronson puts it, no more than the snowflake feels bad about being part of the avalanche. So the other thing to note is that where web traffic-focused revenue models exist, it means that content will remain king. We've all heard that phrase. It's kind of a cliche now. But information becomes an extremely valuable commodity. So announcements drive traffic. Traffic finds its way into social media, which drives more traffic. And then you have these organizational mechanics in place to convert that traffic into cash and principally brand strength. So then you look at how a journalism platform operates, and unfortunately we're in the same problem. We're in the same swamp. We're relying on an outmoded form of money making, which is we rely heavily on web traffic, and this leads to the rise of clickbait. We've all seen BuzzFeed, okay? I hope there's no one from them here. But it's the practice of putting out sensational and misleading headlines in a bid to draw readers into what is I consider substandard content. But in this climate, breaking news becomes absolutely crucial. I would say more so than mainstream news in a lot of ways. If you're the first publication with a story, the traffic you get off that, it is absolutely key to any publication's survival. And whatever that news might be, journalists don't have to factor in the subject's business concerns. I don't need to worry about any business here and how they're publicly perceived. I don't need to worry about what happens in your next sponsor meeting about something I write. I have freedom within ethical guidelines, of course. And this is something I do feel some organizations are slightly envious of and are slightly irritated by. Finally, I just want to demonstrate this in action, so I'm going to bring up my first slide, and I haven't used PowerPoint since I was at university, so I'm going to try and do that now, if we can bring that up on screen. There we go. So I haven't got time to play this to you because I've only been allocated 15 minutes or so. But I would urge you to hunt this out on YouTube. It's both horrifying and fascinating. I'm sure you'll all love it. It's hilarious too. It's the 58th episode of an esports broadcast entitled Inside the Game, where they discuss journalism and esports and sports. Now, to put this in context, there was a journalist, sadly he's kind of no longer relevant or active, but he was called Rod Slasher Breslau. I'm sure some of you will have heard of him. He was probably the leading journalist, the guy who would be here talking about this instead of me. Had his career gone a different path, perhaps. But anyway, he broke a story about an Evil Geniuses player. Evil Geniuses are a big organization in the world of gaming, and they were signing a high-profile Korean player called Jadong. And he broke it on Twitter. And the organization had an apoplexy about it. And everyone in the industry said, oh, this is horrible, you're taking the food out of our mouths, you've leaked our announcement. Now, this is stuff that happens as standard in regular sports. You think about it, you can't pick up a newspaper without looking at the back page. But in esports, it was considered that they were harming EG's livelihood. Now, on this show, this is what makes it so horrifying, they tried to frame this as an impartial debate about journalistic ethics. Now, I will draw you to a few things. That EG next to all of those players' names, what does that stand for? It stands for Evil Geniuses. So perhaps they're not the most impartial people in the world. That chap up there who is moderating the discussion, he works with several companies that also happen to sponsor Evil Geniuses. You will notice these logos up here. Yes, you will find them on the Evil Geniuses homepage. And they criticized the journalist, and they went after him, and they said, this is bad for business. And all Slasher could do was say, I'm just doing my job, man. This is what the people want. I have a right to pursue these stories. I have a right to present this information to people. People want it. It's what I do. But they went after him and they attacked him. And the resulting furor, I'll just bring up the next slide, he said. Oh, no, I've gone one ahead. There we go. Excellent. This made it into the mainstream gaming press. And this is an editorial on PC Gamer called Does Esports Understand Journalism? Again, I find this hilariously ironic given all of the inherent problems in gaming journalism, corruption, collusion, and all the rest of it. How nice of them to give us a lecture. But in this instance, they were correct, they were right. And they basically said that this is a preposterous standpoint to take. Now, this was, I can't see the date there, but I believe it was in 2012. Now, are we any further forward? Absolutely not. We haven't advanced at all. In fact, every time I break a story, the same thing happens. I get attacked on social media. I get called a liar. I have my credibility attacked. I have no idea why people do this. It seems incredible. So before I move on to the sort of final part of my presentation, I want to say to all of you, and if you're ever going to find yourself in this position, which I'm sure some of you will, this is the best piece of advice I can give anybody that wants to operate in our space. It's completely free of charge. I probably could charge for it. You will see why it's incredibly complex. No comment. I don't know why people don't use this more often, but in esports, I think we're so used to viral marketing, we're so used to trying to be clever, and we understand our demographics so much that we feel this is a bit of a cop-out. And I understand that. I think it's, you know, if a politician's involved in a scandal and the guy, you've seen it, they're on the court steps, if you've got anything to say, there's no comment at this time, you think, he's guilty, isn't he? He's guilty. So organizations don't like to use these words, no comment. But it's the simplest way to diffuse a situation. You still retain credibility of the story. It can be perceived that you're not dignifying the leak or the story or the scandal, whatever it might be, with a response. And on top of that, you retain your right to control the narrative at a later date. You don't attack a journalist. and you allow them to retain some credibility. Now it comes down to the individual to ascertain which source they want to believe. And as I said, I did actually have some examples here, but some of these chaps are in the room, and I would consider it would be bad form of me to name and shame. But you know who you are. I'll see you for a beer later. So I want to just bring up this kind of brief, it's kind of a 5-point agenda as to why a free press is good and to why guys like me aren't the bad guys, even though I'm sure perhaps at the end of this somewhat drab presentation you may disagree. So leaks will happen. Right? Now a leak, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, but I will just put it in layman's terms, this is when information that you want to control the flow of gets out. And this happens in esports all the time, and it's quite interesting. A lot of the time, it's an organizational failing. We have so many disgruntled employees in esports because they're volunteers, they're exploited, they don't get paid money. Why would I keep a secret like this when I could talk to a journalist and perhaps curry some favor that might come very useful later on next time there's a pay dispute? So organizations can put a lid on things by actually treating their employees better. I would say vast majority of my sources are disgruntled employees within organizations right now, and God bless every one of them. The other thing that I think you need to understand is that I work with people that fake their own leaks. They come to me and go, hey, Richard, can you make this look like it leaked out organically? Because it's great marketing. It's good. It creates chatter on social media. It creates speculation. That is in its own form, a form of marketing. Now, anecdotal evidence has taught me as well that in terms of traffic, an official announcement will generally do as well, whether it's been leaked previously or not. But a website writing up a secondary rewrite of news that has already been officially announced is a waste of time. You give that to the lowly intern. Here, practice your typing and spelling. It's never going to generate any traffic for a publication. Next point, an independent press makes you look good. And that is that in an industry that is populated by those who all crave authenticity, you will hear this buzzword time and time again during this weekend, although nobody can clearly define it. If you continually create your own content, your own interviews and press releases, and all of your content is in an echo chamber about you and how great you are, you're going to rightly be labeled a fraud by this audience. Can you imagine a political landscape where only Donald Trump's team were reporting or pass comment on the ravings of Donald Trump? I imagine he might look vaguely sane. Now, cleaning house is always great for the industry, even when it's your house. I'm amazed that when I expose, say, for example, a manager that works under an owner and he's been stealing money or treating his players terribly, that owner gets upset at me. I've done you a favor, surely, but apparently not. We don't really look at it that way, and I think if people are going to cut corners and make mistakes and make errors of judgment and do things that are flat out unethical, if you're caught doing this, maybe not at the time, because it definitely sucks to be caught up in one of these stories. It's happened to me, actually, as a journalist. I don't recommend it. It's not fun. But in the long term, it's created a little bit of good within the industry, and it's actually created a little bit of good within your organization. I would say that once the initial furor has died down, you should embrace it. Reach. This is fairly self-explanatory. And no matter how big you are, you can always be bigger. And that's what everybody should want if you want to be successful. So how are you going to achieve that? Well, you're certainly not going to achieve it by closing off segments of the independent press. And that's what's happening. Some people blacklist, boycott, which brings me on to my next point. There's a big picture awareness. Don't burn bridges. The amount of times the team owner has said, well, that's the last time you ever interview one of my players. Okay, cool, that's fine. 2 years later, will you do an interview with this player? He's just joined. We really want to generate some hype about him joining. The scene is too small. We have too much of a symbiotic relationship to be really burning bridges. And as I've said, I'm open-minded. I don't ever go after anybody because it's a personal crusade. The only thing I want is the esports industry to be bigger and better. Now, the key thing also to remember on this point, and this is the final point I will leave you with, that if a journalist is raining on your parade for one weekend, it does mean for the other 51, there probably is the thorn in the side for your competition, unless you're doing something really wrong. Thanks a lot for listening.
Any questions? Any questions for Richard? Anybody got a question for Richard? Or are we all just going to be like, no comment and be done?
No, I've
I taught them well. It means we were paying attention.
So within traditional sports, and again, we're always comparing esports and the rise of esports to traditional sports, we have things like ESPN and Fox Sports and networks dedicated to sports. 2 questions. What do you think will will there be an ESPN of esports, and what form will it take? And secondly, do we consider ESPN independent journalism in traditional sports, given like the fact that they broadcast content, that they need content, and yet they also go after Spygate and Deflategate editorially, journalistically?
So the first question, for the longest period of time in journalism, everybody said, we need to be the ESPN of esports. In fact, hilariously, I just had a job offer from someone claiming that their new website that I'd never heard of was going to be the ESPN of esports. Now, the reality is we're so big now, we're not going to create an ESPN of esports. ESPN are going to come to esports. And that's what's happening. They're already advertising for an esports editor right now. A lot of people have said, Richard, you should go for that job. Now, I'm going to answer question 2, and that's going to put me out of the running for that. Are they an independent source of journalism? I think we can probably safely say no, based on how they handled Deflategate, for example, which was they kind of, for those that didn't follow it, they put out a official post, which was that 11 of the 12 balls were underinflated to regulation standards. They didn't even question or query the sources that this came from, and then it was later exposed that it came from emails that, of course, were misinformation plants by the league themselves. This is one of the problems that we have in esports, and that is that we don't have a firewall between where money meets the need for positive publicity to grow a product. In short, if journalism is funded by corporate interests will always prevail unless you've got one hell of an editorial team. So I hope that answers that question.
Any more?
Awesome.
All right. Cool. Thank you very much.
Nice and quick. Thanks a lot for that again. Appreciate it.